Welcome, everyone. Thank you for your interest in the release of today's report, including those of you who are watching our live webcast. You know, as I release this report, I'm mindful of the fact that the start of the new school year is still 26 days away. So there are still 3 good weeks of summer vacation left. But I'm sure if we ask students, they'd say it's far too early to be talking about getting them back to school. But today's report is about what happens when the people responsible for those students aren't prepared well in advance. If only the Toronto school boards and their transportation group had heeded the early warning signs all around them at this time last year, they could have averted or at least mitigated the busing crisis that engulfed them last September. Ce rapport retrace ce qui se passe quand les responsables des élèves ne sont pas bien préparés à l'avance. Si seulement les conseils scolaires de Toronto et leur groupe de transport avaient prêté attention aux signes d'alarme précurseurs tout autour d'eux à cette époque l'an dernier, ils auraient pu éviter, ou du moins atténuer, la crise des transports scolaires qui les a submergés en septembre dernier. Now, if you were affected by the bus driver shortage last fall, I don't need to remind you how serious it was. Thousands of students were stranded when their buses showed up late or not at all. Parents had to scramble to arrange transportation, and some spent terrifying hours not knowing where their children were when they were dropped off at the wrong spots. This was no mere inconvenience. There were serious cases where vulnerable children were at risk. Junior kindergarten students were dropped off by substitute bus drivers at stops several kilometers from their homes, left alone on busy roadways in complete violation of the board's safety protocols. Children with special needs were left outside their schools without any supervision or stuck on buses for hours, leaving them tired, hungry, and upset. Parents had to change their schedules without notice, sometimes at risk to their own employment. Schools were overwhelmed with complaints and the sheer volume of families that they had to contact. And even though parents were clearly desperate for information, the boards didn't issue any formal communications to them until well into the 3rd day of school. Now, my office has had oversight of school boards for almost 2 years. We are well aware that busing is a hot topic of complaint in many boards at the start of the school year, as everyone gets back into their routine and adjustments are made. But what happened in Toronto last September was not business as usual. It was a systemic administrative failure on several fronts, and it was many months in the making. Problems first surfaced after new contracts for busing services were awarded in February 2016, which meant new operators were asked to service different routes. Operators didn't know the actual routes until much later in the year, and those were repeatedly revised, which made it even more difficult for them to assign and retain drivers. We heard of one driver who simply abandoned a bus out of frustration. I announced an investigation because it was evident that this was not a freak occurrence, but the result of systemic issues that could and should have been addressed and corrected so it would never be repeated. That's the aim of any Ombudsman investigation, to spark constructive change that will prevent the same problem from recurring. And more than anything, this case was about communication failures. Communication with the bus operators broke down when they weren't told the actual routes that they would be driving. Communication with parents was practically non-existent until well into the crisis, even though board officials were warned of potential problems in the week before school actually started. The good news is that this year things are being done differently. The boards and their transportation group have cooperated fully with this investigation and have accepted all of my recommendations. They have already made significant progress in implementing them in time for the new school year. La bonne nouvelle, c'est que cette année, les choses se font différemment. Les conseils scolaires et leurs groupes de transport ont pleinement coopéré à cette enquête et ils ont accepté toutes mes recommandations. Ils ont déjà fait d'importants progrès afin de les appliquer à temps pour la nouvelle rentrée scolaire. For example, a new online portal to keep parents informed is now in place. And there will be for the first time a professional call center engaged to handle questions and complaints. Even more improvements are targeted for next year. I will monitor and report on the progress of the board's implementation of all my recommendations. I'm also encouraging all school boards across Ontario to review this report and the board's response for guidance with their own transportation issues. As we enter our third year of working with school boards, I have emphasized how our office can help local officials bring about constructive change, and I think this report is a textbook case. So now I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
Is this more the fault of the school boards or the transportation companies? How do you?
Well, we don't, the objective of this is to solve problems, not necessarily to apportion blame, but I think that there were balls dropped across the board. I think that I look at it as a snowball that started rolling in November of 2015 when a new procurement process was put in place, and operators were rather, they were kind of operating in the blind. They were bidding on blind. They didn't know what routes that they were bidding on, and I think that's where a lot of the problems started. Bus drivers are not paid to get to and from their routes, so they want to have a route that's close to their point of departure, and once the routes were revealed, there were some problems there, and that started the ball rolling. A lack of communication. Once there was a shortage of drivers known, that wasn't communicated to the transportation group, and then once the transportation group knew, they delayed in communicating with the board, and then once the board knew, there were no communication to parents, no warning until the crisis actually happened.
So is there any one person or group responsible for overseeing all this to make sure that it's seamless, that's contacting the transportation group, making sure everything's checked off?
Well, as I said, it's a communications issue, and a communications failure on several fronts. And so that's what our recommendations are aimed at correcting, and making sure that stock is taken earlier on in the year, have meetings well before the school year, and find out if the routes are adequately covered. And I think from the response to my report, that's being done this year. So we're hopeful that things will be in a better state when school starts this year.
Can you go into more detail with some of the recommendations that you made?
Sure. Well, the first one, as I alluded to, it started with this new procurement process, and I think that stakeholders all around all stakeholders had some degree of dissatisfaction with this procurement process. So operators that were bidding for contracts they couldn't bid on specific geographical routes. I think the transportation group would have liked to put more emphasis on experience in urban areas, which they couldn't do. So I think that this new process kind of left everybody a little dissatisfied, and that's where the ball started rolling.
Votre enquête ne se penche pas spécifiquement sur ce qui est arrivé dans les conseils catholiques du côté francophone, mais est-ce que, à votre avis, il y a des conclusions le conseil scolaire francophone devrait s'inspirer?
Effectivement, je pense qu'il y a des leçons à tirer pour tous les conseils scolaires de notre enquête. Une meilleure communication, un protocole qui vise des alertes et informer surtout les parents qui doivent faire des ajustements lorsqu'il y a des interruptions de service. C'est primordial, c'est la communication.
Comment expliquer, parce que je sais que aussi du côté francophone, on utilise souvent les mêmes compagnies, comment expliquer qu'on a vu ces problèmes-là seulement du côté anglophone et non sur le côté francophone?
Je pense qu'il y a eu des manques de services à travers la province, mais c'était plus aigu à Toronto. Puis je pense que ça parle du volume. Il y a 800 000 étudiants qui sont transportés par des autobus scolaires chaque année en Ontario. Il y a près de 50 000 à Toronto et 10 000 avec des besoins spéciaux. Donc, c'est un projet assez complexe et c'est difficile de coordonner. Donc, c'est pour ça qu'on vise la communication d'abord, qui est clé du succès dans un tel projet.
These safety breaches are shocking. A bus driver dropped off a child to a stranger on the side of the street. How at risk were these children? I think you see from up to grade 3, kindergarten to grade 3. I find it shocking that a bus driver would just stop on the side of the road and say, "Hey, take this kid."
And I'm sure the parents did too. So there are penalties, there are financial penalties in these contracts, and as the report highlights, I think there's about $250,000 in penalties that were imposed on the various operators, but the idea is not to penalize, the idea is to keep it from happening again, and so that's why our recommendations focus on training. This purple equals parent, they're supposed to be door-to-door or adult-to-adult service for these kids. And as you said, the ball was dropped, and so our recommendations tackle that issue, and hopefully that. The school boards have said that they're going to adopt our recommendations, so hopefully that will be prevented in the future.
What does it say about the quality of character of the bus drivers?
Well,
Training or whatever led to this.
there was obviously a lack of training, and sometimes, this was a crisis, and people were scrambling to respond to the crisis. So sometimes substitute drivers were put in place. There wasn't time to train them. In other instances, there were taxi drivers that were hired to deliver, and some of the problems were seen with the taxi drivers as well too. So our hope is that this whole calamity will be avoided in the future, when they won't have to resort to substitute drivers that don't have sufficient training, or taxi drivers that are not familiar with the protocols, the safety protocols.
So on that note, how much of a role did the bus driver shortage play into this, and what's different this year?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Okay, so you said they
You
mishandled
mean the
the bus
safety?
driver shortage. Yeah, so
Yeah,
obviously there's
yeah.
still a shortage, is there?
Well, I don't know. You'd have to ask the school boards where they're at right now at this time this year. But the shortage last year forced them into some temporary measures, and calling in substitute drivers, lengthening the routes, to make sure that there was coverage. So you ended up with routes that became exceedingly long, and there might have been some lapses in patience there. And then, of course, as I alluded to, in some instances, taxi drivers had to be called on to service those routes, and they were definitely not trained or familiar with the safety protocols. And so I think that's where you see the linkage between the bus driver shortage and these lapses in security.
What, if any, role does provincial policy making have? Your report focuses primarily on the school boards and an implementation failure there. Is there any role that the province should have taken, or any lessons that the Ministry of Education or Transportation should take?
Yeah, we typically don't get involved in public policy decisions. I mean, there was a contracting protocol in place that was followed. What we look at is whether administratively processes are fair or transparent, and so that was the focus, and I think that's where we add our value. And we really worked hard, all the teams, from investigators to the legal team to communications team, to get this report and investigation done and into the hands of the school board in May. They had the preliminary copies in May, so that our findings could be of use and our recommendations could be implemented well in advance of this school year.
But the fact that this was a local event, that other school boards didn't go through the same kind of crisis, does that suggest this really is only
well, I wouldn't agree with that. I would say that this did happen all over the province, just in different degrees, and because the Toronto boards are have the most volume, or the biggest ones, the situation was worse, and the numbers were higher, but this happened, and there were shortages across the province.
So an online portal, call center, these are all great recommendations, but what guarantees do parents have that this won't happen again? Beyond that, I mean, this is more of a place to go and find out what's going on, but how do we ensure it doesn't happen again?
Well, guarantees there are none, but what we will do is we will monitor the implementation of my recommendations, because they are aimed at preventing this from happening again. So we'll follow up, and we have good communication with the boards and with the transportation group, and they've committed to implementing the recommendations. They'll follow up. We'll follow up every 6 months, and I'm confident that we'll have good discussions if problems arise. I don't think. Look, nobody wants this to happen again. Nobody does, and not the parents, not the school board officials, and not the transportation group. So I think that they are really motivated to keep this from happening again to the extent possible.
How the parent portal and this call center works?
How does it work? Well, there'll be real-time information, I'm told. They're going to have GPS on the buses, and parents will be able to know where buses are at any given time. So any delays will be fed into that, and they can be apprised of delays or disruptions. And then the call center will be more readily available and with more people to receive calls, so that they can register complaints or give information. So it's all about improving communication in both directions, and that's what's a focus of our recommendations.
This is up and running this September.
Pardon me?
This starts this September.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate your interest. Enjoy the rest of your summer. Oui.
Pourquoi vous êtes confiant que ça ne se reproduira pas cette année?
Ben, comme je l'ai dit, il n'y a pas de garantie, mais je suis confiant que la crise, la situation, notre enquête a été prise au sérieux par les conseils scolaires. Ils ont fait du bon boulot à adresser les recommandations et nous sommes encouragés avec le progrès qui a fait jusqu'à date. Merci.